Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Martinson, CEO of Peak Prosperity. I'm here with a news update for you. And it's been a little while, I know. And part of that has been due to the fact that I'm experimenting with new technology, new look and feel, and trying to bring a higher quality product to you. And I have to confess, there's been, I don't know what to say anymore. Things are just so insane right now. I feel like there's a lot of people out there. I just don't know where they're coming from or what they're talking about or what drives them or motivates them. It feels like we're in an era where really irrational, illogical things are coming forward, including I talk with people who are very smart, who are convinced that quantitative easing really didn't drive asset prices, even though the Federal Reserve said that's what it was going to do. And even though they said that's what they were trying to do. And every time stocks wobble a little bit, there's the central banks out trying to get everything growing again. And by growing, I mean stocks and bonds going up in price, that and real estate too, if they could. So that's what they've been doing. And of course, I'm a huge critic of this because, well, for lots of reasons. Let's look at the tiered reasons for this. First, infinite growth on a finite planet is not possible. It's a bad idea. It's already proving harmful. We can already see the edges of our limits to growth. We know that we have to come up with a whole new paradigm here at some point where we transition to not growing anymore. And that, of course, is just something that all the ruling powers, whether they're political or monetary, that being the central banks, they don't know how to do anything but just grow all the time. So critique number one of the Fed is that they're attempting to sustain the unsustainable. And this is the title of a talk I've been giving most recently at Berkeley over Skype to a class there examining things around sustainability. And that's my main critique is, look, we have an economic system predicated on debt-based money that has to keep growing or it collapses. And that's, of course, what the Federal Reserve and other central banks are so afraid of. They're locked onto the back of this charging rhino called growth. And they know that this rhino is either charging forward or it's going to stumble and trip and collapse on them and create a lot of difficulty. So that's part one of my critique. Part two is that central banks are not wealth creating organizations. They are wealth redistributing organizations. They don't print prosperity out of thin air. They print purchasing power and then they hand it to a very select group of people. What the Federal Reserve has done and what all central banks have done is they create winners and losers. That's their job. They pick winners and by default, they have to select losers. So in this story, who have been the winners? Well, pretty easy to detect. Right? The wealth gap, the largest on record. There are now 5 people who own as much as the half of the rest of the world. And by own, I mean financial assets. So this is directly the outcome of Federal Reserve and other central bank actions. They picked winners. It's the ultimate trickle-up effect, not trickle-down. Trickle-down was this idea that if you give a lot of wealth to certain people, the so-called job creators, that it'll trickle down because they'll create more jobs. That'd be great. We don't have any evidence that that worked in the past, or now particularly, where all that's happened with all this freshly printed money is it's created easy borrowing that has allowed corporations to mostly buy back stocks, their own equities, and do financial engineering, which didn't create a lot of growth, hasn't created a lot of growth in income. Yeah, I don't need to tell you this because you may be one of the people out there who didn't receive a lot of this benefit. And who am I talking about? Really, the 99%. The 1% received most all of this. And in fact, the 0.5% received even the largest share of that. And of that, the 0.1% received the largest share of that. And of course, the that in this story is income, it's wealth. And where did that come from? Well, good question. Glad you asked. It came from everybody else. It comes from the 90%, 99% to the 1%. That's because the central banks are redistributive organizations. So a really important article came out. It was an opinion piece in Financial Times, and I want to take you through it because this thinking is starting to really come through. And if you understand really what's happened and what the central banks have done in their social engineering, you will understand why the future is likely to be very turbulent, socially, sociologically, politically, for sure. And I want to make sure we go through that. So let's look at this right now. Here it is. This was the title of that right here. That's the title of this piece. And I'm going to read parts of this out to you because this is really fascinating. And I think it came out just right. So this came out on March 1st. And this was written by this guy, David McWilliams. David did a great job, David. If you're listening, I really like this piece a lot and love to interview you for it. Quantitative easing was the father of millennial socialism. The Federal Reserve's bid to stave off depression sowed the seeds of a generational revolt. This article starts, is Ben Bernanke the father of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Not in the literal sense, obviously, but in the philosophical and political sense. Well, yes, absolutely, because the key piece here, which we'll get into in this article in a second, was that by selecting these winners and losers we just talked about, humans don't like injustice. We're primates. We're social creatures. We don't like things that are deeply unfair. Was it deeply unfair for the Federal Reserve to decide that nearly everybody should be a loser in this story and that very few people should be the outstanding, outrageous benefactors? No, it wasn't right for them to do that. And it created a lot of social tension. We saw that already. We've seen it in Brexit. We've talked about that. We saw it in the Catalonia breakaway. We're seeing it in the yellow vests right now. More on those in just a minute on this podcast broadcast thing right here. And we're seeing it in the rise of so-called socialism on the left, and as a response to Trump, who was also a byproduct of the Federal Reserve. So if I was going to subtitle this article, I would say, yes, absolutely, Ben Bernanke is the figurative father of the birth of socialism as exemplified by Cortez here. But he's also the father of Trump having come into power. So if you don't like either of those outcomes, or you don't like the fact that your Federal Reserve is monkeying around politically big time, then you really should pay more attention to this particular aspect of it, because this is the driver, the headwater of the Niles. Okay, let's go on here. Let's look at this. Mr. Bernanke's unorthodox cash for trash scheme, otherwise known as quantitative easing, I love that, cash for trash, it was, drove up asset prices and bailed out baby boomers at the profound political cost of pricing out millennials from that most divisive of asset markets, property. This has left the former comfortable, but the latter with a fragile stake in the society they are supposed to build. Now, this is a really, really important point right here. This idea is that what the Federal Reserve did in picking their winners and losers was they said, hey, we have to drive financial asset prices back up again. And they're going to include real estate in that. So how did the Federal Reserve do that? They implemented this thing called quantitative easing, more easily understood as cash for trash. The Federal Reserve got out its magic keyboard, hit enter a bunch of times, and printed up $1.75 trillion to buy mortgage-backed securities and another $2 trillion to buy treasury bonds, driving interest rates down. And what happens when interest rates go down? If you're in the real estate business, you'll understand interest rates come down, prices go up. So they drove prices of real estate back up. And they drove up the prices of bonds, and they drove up the price of all the equities. And in so doing, they rewarded lavishly all the people who already held those things. But if you were a first-time home buyer who had not yet engaged in that first-time activity, or you were looking to move up out of the house you started in into a house to accommodate your growing family, you were out of luck. That's how that worked, because you got priced out of that market. And so that's what the Federal Reserve did. So let's continue on here. Let's look at this next piece. Before we look forward, it's worth going back a bit. The 2008 crash itself didn't destroy wealth, but rather revealed how much wealth had already been destroyed by poor decisions taken in the boom. This underscored the truism that the worst of investments are often taken at the best of times. Hey, that's also true today. But you know what? This is an understanding around bubbles and bubble dynamics and crashes and manias and booms and panics and all of that that's been understood for a really long time. Let's look at one of my favorite economists and philosophers, John Mills, way back in the 1800s said, panics do not destroy capital. They merely reveal the extent to which it has been destroyed by its betrayal into hopelessly unproductive works. Now, this is a well-known thing. Obviously, it's been understood since the 1800s, probably the 1700s, on an economic principle. The Fed lost sight of this principle and decided that the extremely stupid things they did in creating the 2000 bubble needed to just be double done to create the 2007 bubble, which then burst, and now they've tripled or quadrupled down on those idiot mistakes and given us the everything bubble we have today. And in so doing, they sacrificed a generation. They picked winners and losers. This is who they are. They are not a kindly organization. I know they're treated with kid gloves by the Senate, by the House, when they're questioned. I know they're treated in ultra kid gloves by the press, the mainstream press that is not bringing you the news you need on a constant basis. But leave that aside. Understand that the Fed made decisions that weren't monetary, that weren't financial. They were social and they were political. Because to take from the 99% to give to the 1% is a deeply political act, especially in a country that doesn't have campaign finance laws, right? So this goes without saying. And by the way, the Fed was trying to paper over all of the hopelessly betrayed capital that had already been betrayed. It already was destroyed. There was nothing to fix in 2008. It was just some dumb decisions that needed to be undone. And instead of that, the Fed decided to embark on massive social engineering and to drive up the prices of everything, as if the tail could wag the dog in this story. Let's carry on. Some really great quotes to continue with. However, such hyper trickle-down economics also meant that wealth inequality was not the unintended consequence, but the objective of policy. David, way to go. I've been saying this for many years. I'm finally glad to see it in print in the Financial Times. Needs to get elsewhere. What happened here, people, was the objective of the policy. It wasn't an accidental byproduct. It wasn't an unintentional, unfortunate thing that occurred. The concentration of wealth was the intention of the policy of the Federal Reserve. So here we are. We're in a hyper trickle-down situation at this point in time, only it's not trickling down. Why isn't it trickling down? Because the rich have discovered that there really aren't great places to invest right now. They're not interested in investing in you as an individual, as a worker. The only places the rich are interested in investing right now is in robotics and other ways that their capital given to them, handed to them by the Fed, can now be used even more productively, meaning to accumulate more wealth for them, less for you. So this is a deeply unfair, socially divisive set of practices. And so that's why it brings us back to the title of this, which is, is Ben Bernanke the father of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Well, yes. And many more like her and other people besides who are going to rise up and say, this is unfair. And so there's no way to undo this at this point because it's been so unfair for so long that there's a lot of damage that has to be undone in this story. And it's not going to be undone easily because, well, maybe. But history says that power does not cede power carefully or willingly or gladly. So let's move on to this next piece here. Soaring asset prices, particularly property prices, drive a wedge between those who depend on wages for their income and those who depend on rents and dividends. This wages versus rents and dividends game plays out generationally because the young tend to be asset poor and the old and the middle-aged tend to be asset rich. Unorthodox monetary policy, therefore, penalizes the young and subsidizes the old. This is really one last shot at the boomers trying to get their fair share out of this whole story. That's really what's happening here. And it's really unfortunate because one does not simply throw its young under the bus or it's weak or it's old or it's infirm or any one entire swath of a society without creating the appearance, if not the reality, of that being a deeply unfair society. So that's really what happened here. And if you want some data to go along with that, here's what it looks like. Let's take a little tour through this data. Let's say you were a young person attempting to buy a home in Dallas over the past 10 years. Here's what happened to Dallas house prices. That arrow marks it from the peak of the former bubble. In Dallas, house prices are way above their former bubble peaks, enormously expensive. And some people go, oh yeah, but Chris, mortgages are cheaper, so you have a lower monthly cost. Let's not forget about the 20% down payment. That rises with price tick for tick. It's a linear proposition. So sorry for all you young people and first-time home buyers and an entire young generation trying to buy houses in Dallas. The Federal Reserve decided that the boomers living there deserve to live in houses that cost more than you deserved the opportunity to buy into and participate in society. That's unfortunately the only way to look at this. There aren't any other interpretations that make sense here. And oh, by the way, if you are one of those boomers who owns a house in Dallas and it went up in price, congratulations, you still live in the same house, only now your property taxes, your insurance costs have gone up because your house is worth more, right? Oh, but Dallas, how about Denver? What if I'm a young person trying to live in Denver? Oh, sorry, same story here. Would you look at that? Look at the huge increase in the prices that have gone up there from the former bubble peaks. What about Seattle? Same deal, right? Just enormous. These are unbelievable bubble charts, and it bears repeating that the former peaks you see there were at the height of one of the most ill-advised, stupidest, capital betraying bubbles we'd ever been in, only we've quadrupled down on that particular story. So that's the story that we have going on here. And thank you, Financial Times, for printing that opinion. Thank you, David, for writing that. And we'll put a link to that at my website so that you can find it more easily. It hit all over Twitter yesterday. I really enjoyed that article a lot. So carrying on. One of the other things that happens, this isn't just a U.S. story. I'm picking on the U.S. Federal Reserve, but the European Central Bank has gone further, done more, and enormous amount of damage has happened in Europe. And now people are rising up against this, in France in particular, but the Yellow Vest movement is starting to spread. We're now in the 16th week of the Yellow Vest movement, which is notable in my country, the United States, for one thing. Nobody's talking about it. It's not in the news. It's sometimes last weekend on Sunday, there was a big raft of papers and articles that got written about how anti-Semitism was on the rise as a consequence of the Yellow Vests, right? And excuse me, if it wasn't that, it was that a majority of Yellow Vest protesters believed that Princess Diana was murdered in a conspiracy. So they're either anti-Semites or conspiracy theorists. They were doing everything they could to smear them. But if you actually look at what's going on, look at the pictures of the people from the Yellow Vests, and you're going to have to search them out. I go to Twitter and type Yellow Vests, and then I can sniff through all the feeds that are coming, and then take a look. And you know what you're going to see? People. You're going to see ordinary people. That's who's participating in the Yellow Vest protests. And what's really fascinating is there's a chant that just emerged this weekend, is a very popular one. And yes, it's Saturday today. Yes, there are lots of protests going on. Yes, there's thousands, tens of thousands of people. The newspapers are busy not covering it, or if they are, saying, oh, they're dwindling. But check out this chant. I found this really interesting. This new chant that's come up is work, consume, keep your mouth shut. Work, consume, keep your mouth shut. That doesn't sound particularly anti-Semitic to me or laden with any conspiracy theories. It's the people of France, the 99%, noting that all their economic oxygen has been sucked away, and that the neo-classical economists out there, the neoliberal economists, all these other people out there, all their little neo-whatnots and the neocons, when you get right down to it, are really, it's just been a class war that the central banks have stoked, ignited, and that class war is now raging. The rich have already won this first set of battles, no question about that, but the Yellow Vests represent the next wave. And of course, they're being met with either completely being ignored by the press. They're being met with extraordinary violence by the police of France, who very shameful what they've been up to over there. And they are very much, if you actually listen to them, quoting things which tell you that these are just people who no longer have that sense of opportunity, no longer have a future that they believe in. And This is something that's happening all over the world. And the press is doing everything it can to keep people distracted, divided, not paying attention to the right things, focusing on things that are completely meaningless to their lives, while this looting operation continues on almost unabated across all of the major Western economies of the world. And that's just the nature of the beast right now, which is why it's so important for you to be listening to this and to be taking this information in, because this is going to continue until it's forced to stop. And at Peak Prosperity, what are we talking about right now? Well, last week I put out a piece about how we are living in the Groundhog Show, which is a mashup, right, of Groundhog Day with Bill Murray and The Truman Show, which is about a gentleman who wakes up day after day in a simulated reality. We are in the Groundhog Show right now. If you watch the markets, oh my God, they just power higher and higher. Mysterious buyers step in. I know there's no mystery to me. It's central banks and it's their proxy agents operating through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and other leveraged points where they are coming in and driving the markets higher. Why? Well, to make things look better and to, spread confidence and to create market stability and to banish that dreaded volatility, which means, stock prices sometimes going down. So come check out the Groundhog Show. It's a piece I've got as well. I want to point out that we've been running real estate webinars for anybody who cares to join up. Our next one is going to be March 9th. The prior ones are all recorded. You can get access to those. This contains information from our good friends at the Real Estate Radio guys. We got Robert Helms and Russell Gray, and they just have decades of real estate investing experience. They're sharing it through a webinar. You don't have to travel to some seminar to go, check these out. You can just sit in the comfort of your home. And if you do, very nominal cost to participate, and the information's worth a lot more. This next one, we're going into the actual numbers around that. How would you become a real estate investor? This is something I'm personally interested in. I think people are always going to be living in a house or needing a place to stay or wanting to conduct commerce. And I think there's a great role here to play for people who want to be real estate investors. And there's some really good information here. So this is just some of the information we're offering as we try and surf through these times and figure out, well, what do I do if the powers that be are just going to continue to rig and control things as much as they seem to be interested in doing? And that's our news update for this week. Come by Peak Prosperity. Hey, our seminar this year sold out early. So for anybody who's thinking of attending that, not this year. We've already got a long waiting list for this year. So maybe next year. Would love to see you. But for everybody who is coming, I can't wait. It's going to be a fantastic time in Sebastopol. We'll help that community get past some of the flooding it's just been experiencing by bringing some of our business to them. So with that, I will see you next time. And please let me know if you found this easier to follow, or if the format worked for you or didn't work, or why, or if you have any tips, or if you'd be willing to help. Just let me know. And I'd be wide open to figuring out how better to bring information to you that you can't afford to live without.